who want to see it. So happy Bosworth Day.
Happy Bosworth Day.
It should be a holiday. So I'm Nathan. I'm gonna mute other people, but you guys, I will have the chat open, and please feel free to chat if you have a question. And also, I will unmute people when it gets to be the point where there are questions. Awesome. So, Nathen, for people who don't know you, do you want to just? Oh, but I didn't even say hi. Hi. Just launch straight into it. You doing well?
Yeah, yeah, ish.
Ish. Yeah.
Hungry, tired, the usual.
It's a big day for you. You were just doing something else for the Bosworth people.
Yeah, I did one for the Bosworth Heritage Centre. We did like a Zoom live. I mean, pretty much the same as this. I mean, it made sense. I mean, they asked, you asked, I mean, I'll just do it all in one day, you know.
Oh, yeah. It's a big day.
Get in the mindset, you know. So
it's a big day. Awesome. Okay. Well, I have a list of some questions, and I think you'll probably have stuff that you want to add. So the first thing today, of course, is a really big day. Oh, for people who don't know you, do you want to just take a minute to introduce yourself too, and then get into what today is?
Yeah, okay. Well, my name is Nathan. I write books generally based on and around the Tudor Dynasty, in particular Henry VII. My previous book was The House of Beaufort, which kind of filled the gap in between John of Gaunt and the Tudors. You know, essentially just looking at who the Beauforts were, where they came from, and what role they played really in the 15th century. The Beauforts are often only portrayed as backing characters in other people's stories, and they're normally the bad guys, you know, for if you're reading any books that deal with the House of York or deal with the Wars of the Roses, the Beauforts are, I think they get a bad deal. So I tried to write a book looking at it from their point of view to try and see, you know, when you put yourself in someone's shoes, you see a different vantage point. You know, very few people are baddies, you know, in history. You obviously have a few wrong uns, but generally speaking, people are acting. You know, you need to see what their motivations are, and they can only act in the world as they see it around them. Same as us today. You know, I can only act as I see the world, as you know, from my background, from my perceptions of things. So I thought it was quite important to put myself in the Beaufort shoes and see what was what. And hopefully the book kind of brought them out of the shadows a bit. My next book will be based on Henry VII himself rather than his family. But again, that's looking very specifically at his reign and how he dealt with the pretenders who came against him. Because again, with that story, we often see it from the pretenders' point of view. Like Matt's in the room, so he's, you know, already written a book very focused on their point of view. You know, that's often been the case because people are excited by the mystery of who the pretenders were, but people don't look at Henry's point of view, you know. So hopefully, again, I am giving a different vantage point to what people are perhaps used to.
Yeah, I'm excited for your Pretender book to come out too.
Yeah.
So set the stage for us. Why are we talking today?
Because I didn't have much else to do on a Saturday evening. But no, I mean, today is the 535th anniversary of the Battle of Bosworth. Obviously, Bosworth is perhaps one of the most important turning points, if you want, in English history. It was, you know, the very famous battle that saw the end of Richard III, brought down the House of York, brought down the House of Plantagenet in a way. and gave us the Tudor Dynasty.
Sure.
You know, without Bosworth, we don't get Henry VIII. We don't get Elizabeth I. Arguably, we may not get the British Empire and all that entailed. You know, we don't know because we can't go back and see how history would have turned out in an alternative universe. But even though historians these days don't like to put things into these nice little boxes, because obviously it's continuity, it's not, you know, overnight this stopped and that started. Bosworth has traditionally been seen as that out with the old, in with the new kind of period.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, so set the stage for us, because and I know I saw Matthew came on too, so if he wants to pipe in here sometimes, especially towards the end after when there's more time, please feel free to chat on and I'll unmute and that'll be fun. He's like, no, okay.
I'm more than happy for Matt to talk about Richard III because the guy bores me. So, okay. You know, Richard, not Matt, you know.
Okay. Well, let's take it from Henry's perspective then. So during the reign of Edward IV, things seem pretty stable and it seems as if things are just going to go on and they've got sons and things are good. And then he dies suddenly and everything kind of thrown into turmoil again. And somehow the sons are gone, whether, who knows, this isn't the place for that, but the boys are gone. And kind of set the stage for me of what's going on in the life of Henry Tudor at this point, because he had left earlier. And so he's still in Brittany. Do you want to kind of tell me what changed for him and what was going on for him?
Yeah, so just to add context, I'll try and be quick, but, you know, Henry Tudor was born in the 1450s. He was brought up by the Yorkist William Herbert, because his father died before he was born. So he was brought up until the age of 14 with, you know, the enemies of his family. In Wales, you had the two most powerful families in Wales during the 15th century were the Herberts and the Tudors, and they were enemies, you know. There's always like a mini War of the Roses going on in Wales. So Henry was forcibly sent to be brought up with the Herberts while his uncle Jasper was in exile. At 14, the Lancastrians come back on the throne for 10 months. Henry's life seems to he's now 14. His uncle Jasper's taken him back into his care. But the Lancastrians get booted off the throne very quickly. This time Jasper goes back into exile. He takes Henry with him. So first 14 years of Henry's life, he's born.
And can I just ask you to clarify why he took Henry with him? Because Henry has a very different distinction in his life at this point because some people died, right? So he now
Edward IV has basically wiped out a lot of the Lancastrian threats left to him. Henry VI has been killed. His son, Edward the Prince, has been killed. So the Lancastrian line is really getting thin. Mm-hmm. Young Henry Tudor does have a Lancastrian pedigree. It's not great, but it's there. You know, he's a great-great-grandson of Edward III, or great-great-great, perhaps. But so were quite a few other people. But with Henry, it's always, you can sell a story. Now, at that time, I don't believe he was being positioned as a 14-year-old boy to be a potential claimant. I mean, the House of York have won, and there's plenty of Yorkists around.
Right.
But Jasper Tudor is completely unwilling to reconcile himself to the House of York, and he flees abroad, but he takes Henry with him. You know, I don't think Henry was at danger at this point in his life. I think Henry would have just been reconciled to the House of York if he'd stayed. But by taking him abroad, he's, Edward IV is a bit nervous of this child being abroad. Now, for the next 14 years, Henry lives abroad. And there were moments where it looked like he was going to be brought back to England to, I can understand why from Jasper's point of view and perhaps Henry's point of view, he was being brought back to be killed.
Right.
He could have been brought back to be reconciled and married into the House of York. That's
because there were ideas that he might marry one of Edward IV's daughters at that point, or weren't there?
there were discussions. I mean, again, Edward IV, a lot of Edward IV's rationale was to try and reconcile the two sides. But he equally, what he did, he was wiping out some of the claimants. I mean, Henry Holland, the Duke of Exeter, who had a far better Lancastrian claim than Henry Tudor, he mysteriously drowned on Edward IV's ship in 1475. Now, it's at that point that Henry gets bumped up another level in this Lancastrian, pedigree. But either way, so basically get through to 1483. Henry Tudor still abroad for 14 years, and he probably would have stayed there for a long time. But then Richard takes over the throne again. He steals the throne, usurps the throne, he's offered it, he's granted it, whatever the terms. When Richard becomes king, things change because half of the Yorkist household leave. They don't want to be serving under Richard III. They need anybody who can be positioned against him. Mm-hmm. Henry Tudor is abroad. Henry Tudor is just the right man in the right place at the right time. He's the right age, and he's unmarried. They've just gone, look, we'll position him against Richard III. He has an all right claim. It works. We can sell that story. If we marry him with Elizabeth of York, even better. Mm-hmm. That's essentially it. I mean, he's gone from being a complete nobody to Henry's rise is solely to do with Richard. Created the monster of Henry Tudor by doing what he did. Interesting. Who was Henry Tudor if Edward V had been left to carry on reigning? He still would just been just a random nobody abroad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. So then tell me about the first rebellion, the Buckingham, and what happened with that first kind of try to...
The way history's been written and understood is that people seem to go along with the idea that Buckingham basically was Richard's number two, in that he was the highest ranked man to back Richard up when Richard became king. But then he suddenly defects. And the argument has always been he defects to Henry Tudor's side and they were going to try and put Henry Tudor on the throne. I don't buy that. I think 1483, Buckingham defected from Richard for whatever reason. That could be, was he disgusted that Richard killed the princess? Did he kill the princess himself? And there was a breach between him and Richard. Either way, Buckingham's left Richard's side. Now, why would somebody who has had a fairly poor career up to that point, because Buckingham was not granted any power under Edward IV. Mm-hmm. He's risen super high under Richard III. He's been granted, I think he's constable. He's granted great offices of the state, supreme power in Wales. Why would you leave that if you're already number two? Where do you go from being number two? You only go to number one. You don't go from number two to serving some random Welsh guy in Brittany and backing him up, do you? Let alone the fact that Buckingham had a much better claim to the throne than Henry Tudor. Buckingham himself was also a Beaufort. He was Margaret Beaufort's nephew, by marriage as well. I don't buy that he left Richard to back up Henry Tudor. That doesn't make any sense. So I think in 1483, Buckingham's rebelled.
And there was some intrigue there too with like Margaret Beaufort and plans that, can you just talk about how she was involved with that too?
Yeah, I mean, again, the assumption has always been that Margaret Beaufort was scheming to get Henry Tudor on the throne. I think when Matt might know more about this, but when Richard first became king, Margaret Beaufort met with Richard III. And they had a meeting, and I think the meeting was to discuss what to do with Henry Tudor. Now, what I think must have happened is Margaret's come away from that meeting uncertain that her son is going to be allowed to come back. And I think she's just thrown her lot in, you know what, we're going all out against Richard. Yeah. Buckingham's there. I think they're two separate plots going on, and they've decided to unite along with all of the Yorkist Edwardians who hate Richard. I think it's just a multiple. Richard's a sentient, and they all hate him, and they're all starting to come together. Margaret sending her man Christopher Urswick abroad to Brittany with money and messages to Henry Tudor, and I think they were going to collide to knock Richard off the throne. But I do believe it was to put Buckingham on the throne. Henry would come back, and maybe Henry might be the number 2 in the kingdom. Matt brought up something earlier that I hadn't really considered. There was definitely talk about Henry Tudor marrying Elizabeth of York, as eventually happened. So that brought the Woodvilles and the Beaufort Tudor faction together. I think perhaps that plan wasn't necessarily to make Elizabeth Woodville the queen. Again, this is Matt's point earlier, and I think I can see what was happening in that they wanted to make Buckingham the king, Henry Tudor to come back number 2, main earl in the kingdom, marry Elizabeth Woodville, Elizabeth of York, so she would have become a countess, not a queen, and happy days thereafter. But Buckingham rose up too early. He got caught. He got betrayed. The Reigns ruined his rebellion. He was caught and he was executed. Now,
was Henry part of? Tell me how Henry was part of that.
Well, Henry was supposed to come in and invade England and back up Buckingham. Or the traditional story is Henry was coming in to become king, and Buckingham was supposed to back him up.
Right. Okay.
The winds blew Henry off course, and he failed a couple of times to land in Dorset. There's also the suggestion that as Henry tried to land, Richard's men were on the coast, and they were beckoning him, come on, land, Henry. And I don't know how he would have known that but something spiked him, and he decided not to land, and he went back to Brittany, or France even, actually. And Buckingham rose up, was caught, was executed. So Henry never actually got into England in 1483. Now, what's interesting for me is Buckingham was executed on the 2nd of November, 1483. The very next day, the 3rd of November, is the first time I've been able to track anyone proclaiming Henry Tudor to be the king. On the 3rd of November, on Bodmin Moor in Cornwall, a bunch of rebels declared Henry Tudor king. So that leads me to believe that Buckingham was always supposed to be the man. As soon as his head was chopped off in Salisbury, right, screw it. Henry Tudor is now our man. And then 1 month later, on Christmas Day, is that formal declaration that Henry Tudor is going to marry Elizabeth of York, and he's going to unite the lands. So that's how I read it. I mean, that's how I read what happened in 1483. I think something happened with the princes. We won't go too much into that, but something happened. Buckingham defected and joined forces with Tudor, Woodvilles. They were all just coming together to try and snare Richard III. But obviously, this is all open to interpretation and debate, but that's how I read it. And that's what makes most sense to me. Then of course, we then need to consider, what happened to the boys, who was spinning the lies, was Mark Beaufort lying to try and get the Woodvilles on side, etc., etc. I think they were all just opportunists. It's all because of what Richard did. Rightly or wrongly, whatever he did, it just created mayhem.
Yeah,
it just
for sure.
Yeah, 1483 is just one chaotic year. Yeah. And it's all because Edward IV got too fat and died too early, basically.
So then tell me what happened then in 1484. And a lot of times, like, the history books jump from 1483 to 1485, but there's like a year and a half in there. So tell me what, were Yorkists disaffected Yorkists going over? Was he building up? What was he doing?
Yeah, I mean, 1484 is a bit of a lost year, to be honest. I think, we've got to Christmas Day, 1483. Henry's declared, I'm going to marry Elizabeth of York. You all now support me, and you've sworn oaths to me. 1484 is the year where they're trying to mobilize support. But Henry, you know, who's going to support Henry? He's still in exile. He's still in Brittany. Richard's now got his foot under the table a bit better. And he's starting to really cajole the Bretons into handing over Henry Tudor. If he can get his hands on him, Henry's done. He's finished. And now, unlike all the years before, Henry is now positioning himself as an alternative. Now, what's happened during this time is the Duke Francis of Brittany, Henry's protector, Henry's guardian, has fallen ill. And the power in Brittany is in the hands of a chap called Pierre Landais. And he is a man who is more amenable to what Richard wanted. And it seems that he started to open negotiations to have Henry handed over. He would have got a lot of money. He would have got a lot of support for Brittany from Richard, because at that time the Bretons were, they were coming under pressure from France. France wanted to conquer them.
Sure.
So, he was looking out for himself. If he handed over Henry to Richard, he gets money, he gets troops. Henry's gone. Everyone's happy apart from Henry, who would have had his head chopped off. Right. Now, what's happened is word has got to Henry Tudor via Margaret's intelligence networks, sending her man Christopher Urswick over, and word has reached Henry, you need to get out of Brittany. They're coming for you. Mm-hmm. One night in 1484, this is exactly what he does. Because he was being watched, but he did have an element of freedom in his time in Brittany. And he mentioned he was going to see a friend, and he got in his horse and he started riding. What happened was, as soon as he reached the forest, he changed clothes. He put on, some clothes of a labourer, and then he just got back on his horse and he just started. He just bolted straight for the French border.
How long of a ride was that? How many miles?
I don't know. It must have been within. I think he would have been a van at the time, which is quite close to the border. I'll definitely have to Google Maps.
No, I was just curious about how that the boats.
It must have been. It's got to be within 20, 30 miles or however. A reasonable horse ride is. Now Pierre Landais worked out. Where's Henry gone? Oh my God, he's gone. He sends his men after him. Apparently, Henry only reached the French border with 1 hour to spare. And he made it. Now, what's interesting, what I really like about this part of the story is that Henry's abandoned all of his men, all those Yorkists who swore loyalty to him, the Welshmen that were there, the Lancastrian veterans who were there. He just abandoned them all, and he just legged it because he had to. He couldn't be captured. Duke Francis has recovered, and he's worked out what the hell's going on here, and he's not happy. So he upbraids his man. He says sorry to Henry Tudor, and he lets the entire, the Tudor court in exile in Brittany just leave of free will. He tells them all, look, you can all go to France. He could have just killed them there. He could have refused to let them leave. He just said, look, I'm sorry, Henry, for what's happened. Take your men. You're in France now. And that's how Henry left Brittany to enter France. Now, this is where the story really turns, because Henry needed France. France wanted Henry Tudor all along. They saw Henry Tudor as theirs. He was, of course, of French royal blood as well. His grandmother was Catherine de Valois. But Tudor was well known to the French court. They finally got their hands on Henry. And now they've got a pretender who they can position against Richard. And started, the money was slow come in. It took, that's why nothing happened in 1484, apart from this particular incident. But now he's in the French hands. Now they can start to fund him. And now they can really start to work against Richard. Because at that time, France and England, and Richard's England has started to fall out. And what's interesting, this is exactly what happened later for Henry when he was king. The pretenders, especially Perkin Warbeck. Henry's in the Perkin Warbeck position in 1484. Just a nuisance that the French are trying to use to get at Richard.
And what was going on in Richard's life at this point? Had his wife died and his son died, and what was going on for him as king? There we go.
Yes, that's exactly what was happening.
Okay.
I don't know, Matt, do you want to take over?
If he wants.
Yeah, I mean, his wife died. His sons died first, I think. Richard lost his dynasty there.
Yeah.
You know, with his son dying, he's lost that security. You know, his entire philosophy, I believe, at this point. This is why I do believe that he, you know, rubbed off the princes in the tower, was because he had to protect that future house of Richard, you know,
Right.
House of Gloucester, perhaps it should be termed. But his sons died, and I think that's put Richard at a significant disadvantage now when dealing with Henry Tudor.
Yeah. And this is then kind of when there was the rumors, well, that was the next year that he was going to marry Elizabeth of York, and there was kind of that whole scandal with that, and he had to say that wasn't true, and blah, blah, blah.
What's really interesting about that is, no, Richard wasn't going to marry Elizabeth of York. I think that's been fairly, you know, people have come around to that, you know, it was nonsense. But the rumour mill working against Richard at the time is very interesting, because he had to come out and he had to deny this. And what does that say about his position? What does that say about the respect that people had for him? They had to deny this. And I think that is a tarnish almost on his leadership skills, whether rightly or wrongly, Richard had to deny that. And I think that's very interesting. That is almost a little window into Henry VII, Henry Tudor, and his conspiracy and his plot, thinking we can work on that. We can open up that that lack of respect he seems to have amongst his people. I mean, if Matt wants to discuss some of 1484,
yeah, I was just going to say he's just come on here now too, so we have an extra bonus. Hi, Matt Lewis.
You're muted, are you?
Oh, no, he's not muted. I just can't hear him. I don't know if he was saying anything.
Good. That's how I like Matt. Silent.
I love you too. It's so great. I don't have him muted. Do you have the microphone on in the bottom left? Has the little microphone where you can click to use the computer audio, or maybe if you're, oh, there he is, I think.
No.
Yep. Hi.
Hang on.
Okay, so for people who don't know, you're kind of the other side. You're the Richard side in the sort of debate here, huh?
Bad side, yeah.
So what do you want to say? What can you tell us about what was going on for Richard during this period, from like after the rebellion through 1484?
I think, you know, what goes on for Richard in 1484 is complex and pretty heartbreaking. You know, aside from anything else, the political upheavals of having become king unexpectedly in 1483, however you think he arrived there, I don't think he started 1483 thinking he was going to get into the summer as king. So there's all of that turmoil. There's the October rebellions that have gone on that have obviously exposed the fact that he's not universally loved, and nobody wants to feel like that, do they? They don't want to feel like people don't like you. He gets to the middle of 1484 and his son dies, his only legitimate son. So this is the entire focus of his dynastic hopes. He's got two illegitimate children, but they can't succeed him. And so this throws him into an absolute crisis. He and Anne have been married for more than a decade, unlikely at that point to have any more children if they've only had one up until now. And then to make things worse, as we get towards the end of 1484, Anne, his wife, falls ill as well, and dies in early 1485, probably of tuberculosis from what we can gather, not poisoned by Richard as some sources. And I mean, that was a contemporary rumour that went round in London. You know, Richard had to stand up in London and say that he hadn't poisoned his wife and he hadn't wanted her to die. So these are the kinds of things that are going on. And this, for me, this is a woman who Richard had been happily married to for more than a decade. You know, we can't necessarily say they were madly in love with each other, but they'd had a good, strong marriage that had been productive. So they must have been close. So to be faced not only with her death, but then to have rumours throughout the streets that you killed her. And not only that, but you killed her because you want to marry your niece. You know, none of this is going to put you in a good frame of mind for whatever's coming. And always in the back of his mind, from the end of 1483 onwards, he's got Henry Tudor as that last little bit of trouble that you can't quite get a grip on. He's always just beyond Richard's grasp. You know, as Nathen says, we get these adventure stories of Henry escaping from the grasp of Richard at every turn. And so he's always aware, you know, he seems to spend most of 1484 planning for what to do if Henry arrives, and he doesn't in 1484. But as you get into campaigning season of 1485, he's got to know that that threat is still there. So that threat is on top of huge political problems with being aware of his own lack of popularity, huge political problems with his dynastic failures that are now causing him problems. He's trying to organise a marriage to a Portuguese princess, obviously in the hope of having another son. But he's trying to do this amidst rumours that he's murdered his wife so that he can marry his niece. So his personal life and his personal state of mind by the time he gets to Bosworth must have been pretty horrendous. You know, he's had a terrible couple of years. If he wanted desperately to be king, as most people think he did, then it really didn't go the way he wanted, did it? Yeah. So yeah, you know, he's had a horrendous couple of years, and Henry Tudor is just this kind of nagging little doubt in the back of his mind who's always there just waiting to take his throne from him.
Yeah. And what do you think, to Nathan's point about his popularity, like what do you think that says about, because I've always heard that he was, you know, well liked, especially in the North, and the justice that he brought and things like that. What do you think it means that these rumors were played? Was it just a London thing? Talk to me about that.
I think it's a big Southern thing. So Richard is hugely popular in the North as a champion of justice and equity. There's lots of cases that, you know, I could bore you with, where he favours the common man against the local nobility and the gentry and all of that kind of thing. And I think that's fine for the king's brother to be doing stuff like that up in the North when no one really cares about the North because London's all that matters. So, you know, it's kind of you can indulge Richard in doing all of that while he's Duke of Gloucester up in the North, and it doesn't really affect anyone. But as soon as he becomes king, and we see signs almost straight away that he plans to continue a lot of those policies, you start bringing that to the national stage, and you're suddenly stepping on the toes of people in the South and in London who aren't used to this. They don't know what to expect from this. They're quite comfortable as things are. And Richard is looking at tackling the kind of corruption that makes them rich and powerful.
Right.
And so I think taking those policies onto the national stage is part of what makes Richard unpopular. So it's fine for him to do this tucked away in a corner when he's the king's brother. But when he's trying to make this national policy, I think that's part of what drives people away from him. And that's a failing in Richard. You know, it's a huge policy failure. I think what he tried to do was probably praiseworthy, and we would look at it and think it was good things for the benefit of the common man. But he never achieved it, and he tried to do it so badly and in such an awkward, you know, ham-fisted kind of way that he ended up being brought to a battlefield and killed to get him off the throne.
All right, so that's a good segue. Let's talk about getting to that battlefield, because we could probably go on here for a long time talking about Richard and his reign and all that. So Nathen, do you want to talk about Henry's role in getting to the battlefield and how he did? And then maybe Matt can talk a little bit about, I wanted to ask, like, the rumors, like in Shakespeare, that he had these nightmares the night before and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, maybe Matt can talk a little bit about his side of things.
I will if Nathan's okay with it. I don't want to step on his toes. I'll
that's fine.
Messenger later.
I try my best to kind of avoid all Richard kind of, you know. So yeah, you can have him. Yeah, okay. So Henry VII, Henry Tudor, basically, you know, to cut the long story short, France finally decides that they're gonna give him, you know, mediocre funds to launch an invasion. The invasion is ready by the 1st of August, 1485. Henry isn't starting with a great deal. You know, he got some Yorkist rebels, a few Lancastrian veterans, and French mercenaries. They board. Henry had tried to land, as I said, 2 years earlier in Dorset, and it didn't work. Richard had that area covered. I think probably with his uncle Jasper Tudor's counselling, he's gone for Wales. He's gone for Pembrokeshire, which was where he was born. It was where he was, brought up. It is where there's a strong Tudor connection in the area. Mm-hmm. They've landed there. They've landed at Dale on the 7th of August. I mean, that must have been an incredible journey in itself. You're talking a week at sea, going around the Cornish Peninsula, panicking probably all along. Not just, a quite difficult sea voyage. You're heading out into the Atlantic there. It's shipwreck capital. Making the voyage, not knowing what's gonna await you when you land. People have this incredible concept and idea that Henry Tudor was a coward. You don't go across the sea into a country where you're the enemy, where you're the outsider, where I think, everything pointed toward a Henry loss at Bosworth. You're not a coward to do that. There's so many steps there you can go, you know what, this is not a good idea. Let's just stay in France and let's just live out my days here. He's landed in West Wales. The welcome isn't rapturous, but I think it's still better than what, again, some people give credit for. That there was some degree of support for him, particularly from the people of Haverfordwest, which is a town in West Wales that still had connections to Jasper Tudor, who was, once upon a time, many decades ago, the Earl of Pembroke in that area. And they've started to journey up towards Wales. Now, they don't take the most direct route, because the direct route across South Wales would have brought them straight into Yorkist territory in the Welsh Marches. They would have been routed before they've even got out of Wales. Also, in mid Wales, the mid of South Wales, which is exactly where I'm born and brought up myself, is the area, the lands of Rhys ap Thomas. Rhys ap Thomas at this point was showing signs of loyalty to Richard III. He had been charged with holding that area. And what's interesting is Henry avoids a direct confrontation with Rhys ap Thomas, who we know joined him at Bosworth. But at this moment, Henry goes up along the coast of Wales, which is not an easy journey. And Rhys ap Thomas basically shadows him.
Okay.
Shadows him up through.
Pump the jam, pump it up while your feet are stumping.
That's exactly the type of music they were playing on the ship as well.
See, 'cause that's where the party's at, and you
Are we getting
find out
like
if
cold here?
you
Dude.
get your booty on the floor tonight.
Oh, we're getting thing. How do we kick him out? Remove. We got there is even a password for this. That's funny. That's the first time I've been Zoom bombed or whatever. That was hilarious. Okay. Hello. Okay. If that's the worst, that's exciting. Okay. Are you guys still there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Bloody Ricardians. I don't know.
We will.
Oh, that was fun. That was something. Okay.
But basically, Henry journeyed through Wales, to the heart of Wales, and it's quite interesting. He's using a red dragon as his banner at this time. Now, anyone who knows Wales, even to this day, the red dragon is everything. I mean, I've got a red dragon tattoo. It's like a rite of passage when you're 16, 17 years old. Back then, it was still important. It still had magnificent appeal to the Welshmen at the time because it was an ancient Welsh, symbol. And Henry was using this. And I'm sure that did play some role in pulling support to him.
Mm-hmm.
But he had to get out of Wales and he had to get English support. Welsh support was not enough. The Yorkish rebel support, the Lancastrian veterans, the French mercenaries, none of this was enough.
Mm-hmm.
He put Rhys ap Thomas on his side. They met just near Shrewsbury before they turned into England. So they basically landed in Wales, spent another week marching towards what was eventually, Battle of Bosworth.
Okay.
Messages are going back and forth, apparently, between Henry and the Stanleys. You know, they are, at the end of the day, you know, Thomas Stanley, one of the most powerful magnates in the kingdom, was his stepfather. We were discussing earlier, just being a stepfather alone is not enough for him to defect.
Right.
Moral outrage, perhaps, at Richard is not enough. Economic opportunism, however.
So, but I want to go back to where Richard was at this time. How did they meet at Bosworth? Where Richard was coming down. Tell me about, maybe Matt, if you can tell me about what Richard was doing during this point.
Yeah, so Richard has positioned himself at Nottingham, which is as close to the centre of the kingdom as he can get, because he doesn't know where Henry's landing. He seems to have got some intelligence that it would be Milford, and he seems to have mistaken that for a town called Milford, which is near Southampton on the south coast. And so he sent some men there to keep a watch, but obviously it was Milford Haven, so the information wasn't quite right. But he positions himself at Nottingham because it's as close to the centre of the kingdom as he can get, and he doesn't know where the threat's coming from. So Nottingham is somewhere that Richard and the Yorkist kings have used a lot as a centre for preparing for invasion, because it gives you easy access to every corner of the kingdom and you're less likely to get caught unawares. And so he's hunting at Bestwood Lodge when he hears that Henry Tudor has landed, and seems to be quite excited. You know, the day has finally come. He's almost been waiting 2 years for Tudor to land and to fight him. And I think for Richard, this is the opportunity to put this to bed. You know, this is the last opposition to him. This is a chance to prove himself in battle as a great warrior king, but also as God's anointed. You know, God decides the outcome of battles. So whoever wins that fight is God's chosen king. And Richard wants to prove himself that he is, because of all of this opposition that's been fermenting around for him. And then I think when he learns which way Tudor is going, Tudor, you know, as what Nathan says, up the Welsh coast, across sort of mid-Wales to Shrewsbury, and he gets on the A5, the old Roman road, Watling Street, which goes straight from Shrewsbury to London. And I think the key there is that control of London will often be the key to controlling the whole kingdom. Mm-hmm. So once Henry is on that road, Richard is in a race against time then. So I think he sets this muster at Leicester, and we know that places like York that you would think would want to be supporting Richard at this point don't get men to Richard in time. And I think probably he started the muster thinking he had lots and lots of time to get ready, and then Henry makes this dive down Watling Street, and Richard knows that he has to cut him off before he gets to London, because if Henry gets into London, then he's in a whole different world of trouble. And so Richard probably ends up having to strike out from Nottingham to Leicester, and then Leicester to Market Bosworth. You know, that's the point on the A5 where he thinks he can intercept Henry's army, and he probably has to do that before he's as prepared as he would like to be, before he's got all of his forces gathered to him at Nottingham and Leicester. And probably that's part of Henry's thinking, I would have thought, you know, make Richard rush. If you give him time to prepare, he's the king, he can call on the entire country to get behind him. If Henry is lacking in numbers and maybe hasn't had the rapturous response he might have hoped for, then his best bet is to bring this to a head quickly before Richard can get any more prepared than he is. So he makes this dive down the A5 towards London, and Richard is forced to kind of step across his path and fight him there. And so to some extent there, that puts Henry back on the front foot, and Richard a little bit on the back foot and a little bit less prepared. But that's why you end up at Bosworth, because that's where Richard manages to get across Henry's path to London.
And if just to say, if you remember what Matt said about Richard getting his support from the north, a lot of those Yorkish rebels who have joined Henry are drawn from the southern estates and from London. If they get to London, they take London. London's a notorious Yorkist city during the Wars of the Roses, but people forget Henry Tudor's army was half Yorkist. You know, he wasn't really a Lancastrian candidate, so it makes perfect sense for him to get to London and use his Yorkish support to take the city, and then you take the kingdom. So yeah, that's Richard has to get across him, intercept him.
And there was a question here, I think, Nathan, for you. Had Rhys ap Thomas decided to join Henry as he shadowed him up the country?
It's one we don't know the answer to. I think I think Rhys ap Thomas was quite minded that he wanted to join Henry Tudor, because he shadowed him up towards Shrewsbury, and along that way, messengers were going back and forth between the two camps. I think Rhys was holding off until he got a promise from Henry. What is my role going to be if you become king? And Henry basically made him, the chief power in South Wales. When we get to near Shrewsbury, what happens is Rhys ap Thomas meets with Henry Tudor for the first time. They are quite distantly related. They're of roughly, similar background. They know the same people. They have that meeting. Also at that point comes the main powers from North Wales. You have the might of Wales all meeting together. Rhys ap Maredydd Fawr from North Wales, Rhys ap Thomas from South Wales, Henry Tudor, Jasper Tudor, having this meeting on this mountain in Mid Wales. And at that point, they all bond together. And that's because the two Rhyses, Rhys of North Wales, Rhys of South Wales, have got from Henry what they wanted, which was a promise that they were going to. So I don't think it was necessarily a given at the start. I think the marches has given them that time to negotiate along the route.
All right, so then we've got August 21st, and we've got these armies that are going to intercept the next day. They're right there. We've got Stanley's son. Richard has Stanley's son, right? And what else? Tell me about if we're not sure about that. Okay, say something about that.
You're on mute.
What? Oh, yeah, he's muted still. Let me see. Ask to unmute. Yeah,
Sorry,
so
I couldn't unmute myself. I'd only say that lots of Stanley stories that come a lot later, I would be incredibly suspicious of. Okay. Stanley was good at positioning himself, and I think later on he told lots of stories about what had happened between 1483 and 1485 to make himself look good. I'm not convinced. I mean, Stanley excuses himself from Richard's court on the grounds that he's not very well, but still manages to turn up with an army at Bosworth. Lord Strange may have been in Richard's company at that point, who was Stanley's son, but there's not really any evidence that Richard tried to, have him killed or threatened or whatever else. I think those are probably stories that come a little bit later. Although, Richard may well have been panicking so much by this point that he was willing to try and use any leverage that he could. But, if he did threaten to kill him and Stanley's response really was, well, it's fine, kill him, I've got other sons, that all seems a little bit weird to me. So I would just take anything that Stanley says with a pinch of salt, to be honest.
all right. So what are the army sizes like? Tell me the numbers.
Oh God, don't ever talk about numbers when it comes to medieval armies.
But Richard's is bigger than Henry's.
I think the suggestion has been that Richard's army was bigger. I know some people are starting to revisit that a little bit. I think in Mike Ingram's latest book, he kind of questions the army sizes. I don't think the turnout for Richard wasn't great, if I'm right. From the country at large, a lot of people stayed away, which would have limited Richard's. I mean, even the chaps from York didn't make it in time. So this wasn't a big battle, compared to some of the slobber knockers of earlier
Sure.
Wars of the Roses. This wasn't that big a battle. Arguably, Stoke Field years later was bigger than Bosworth in numbers. Let's, for argument's sake, let's say probably in the region of 5,000 either side. Not.
Okay.
Of course, the chroniclers will say there was 150,000 men on each side, and but
Sure. And so then Richard's, tell me about, there's, in Shakespeare, he has these horrible nightmares and all of that kind of stuff. Obviously, we don't trust Shakespeare on Richard kind of stuff, but tell me, where did that come from? Like, was there any notion that he woke up early before the priests were awake and all that? Like, tell me about his morning. Oh, Matt's still unmuted or muted.
Oh, me, sorry. Yeah, I mean, we do get these kind of fairly contemporary commentators saying that Richard rose early before his camp was prepared, so there was no breakfast made for him, there were no priests to celebrate the mass first thing in the morning. And Shakespeare uses that as a reason to give Richard all of these horrendous flashbacks to revisit all of the people that he's murdered and been horrible to. I suspect that the truth is that Richard woke up early because he's full of nervous energy. You know, this day is everything that he wants and probably everything that he doesn't want all at the same time. He wants to deal with Tudor and get that threat gone and done, and he wants to prove his right to the crown of England. But no sane medieval person wants to step onto a battlefield because it's so unpredictable. The whole day could go any way. You could have the numbers but lose the fight, and you're risking your life stepping onto that field. So there's that kind of nervous energy and excitement. And I suspect, you know, he just wakes up early, ready to go, not able to sleep because he's full of this buzzing energy. But Shakespeare just kind of uses that to try and paint Richard as having had these horrendous nightmares and risen early because he just couldn't sleep, thinking about all the evil he'd done in his life. You know, it becomes a little moral tale then. Yeah, just on what Nathen was saying about the numbers, I kind of think if you look at even the traditional maths, if you take Richard's force and Henry's force, I think those with Richard and those with Henry were fairly even. Stanley's numbers are normally counted in Richard's, but if you take them out because they sat on the side, then that makes the numbers fairly even. And if you take out Northumberland's force, which never engaged for whatever reason, then I think Henry almost starts to have the numbers on the battlefield. But yeah, it's notoriously unreliable.
I mean, that's completely supported by what Richard did during the battle. I mean, you know, his vanguard is getting smashed by Oxford's. What choice did he really have? If he didn't have the numbers, Percy, Northumberland's not engaged, Stanley's not engaged. Richard, if he had to do what he had to do in some respects. You know, I once upon a time viewed it as almost like a tactical error, a suicide raid, kind of like a kamikaze in a way. Like, why did he do it? But if the numbers aren't there for him, he had to. You know, he had to take. It's like a boxer almost going for that last gasp knockout when you're down on points at the end. You've just got to go for it. And I think that's supported by the fact that he didn't have these large numbers as people have traditionally thought.
And we had a question here from Rob, said, do we know how many men Richard had with him in Nottingham as he marched the 20-odd miles to Leicester?
No. Only within the confines of the kind of unreliable chronicles. Most will say he marched out of Leicester with 10 or 11,000 men. How reliable that is hard to say. And then I think Northumberland is generally given about 3,000 men out of that. So that brings him down to 8. And I think most people put Henry reaching the field was somewhere between kind of 5,000 and 8,000. So I think the numbers probably start to even out. And by the time Stanley wades in on Henry's side, he's very definitely got the numbers.
Yeah.
I think in my last book, I made quite a conscious decision to try and avoid including or discussing numbers because it's very difficult now. Like a book that like Mike Ingram's book that's specifically based on a battle, they've obviously got to encounter it and they've got to discuss it. Mm-hmm. But I think for myself, in narrative terms, I try and stay out of it because it's so difficult. You know, everyone seems to just throw out random numbers or random revenues. Yeah. You know, it's a lot of men up to no good. We'll put it that way.
For sure.
Yeah.
Okay, and so then we have the battle. What time of day did it start? Like first thing?
7:15 to be exact.
After coffee? Everybody had their caffeine? And
I think you know, the thing is, these guys are waking up very early. You know, for us, you know,
it's summertime, right? So it's getting light at like 5.
I know this battle must have been over fairly early because Henry was back in Leicester by the evening. So Henry was in Leicester. Let's say Henry's in Leicester by 5 o'clock, just to throw out an evening time there.
Yeah.
You know, 20-mile march of 14 something like that miles. You know, that's a couple of hours.
Mm-hmm.
And the battle was done and dusted by midday.
Okay.
Give or take. They had to bury the bodies and so on. So I think early in the morning.
And how would a battle like that start? Like, I mean, I see these battles from like shield walls with Vikings. Obviously that's not the, so like, what was there a procedure? Like what was there, like a protocol, or did you just start going for it?
There would have been some posturing to begin with. I think there's been some speculation there might have been a bit of gunfire back and forth, cannon fire. And eventually, the vanguards are just going to engage. They're waiting for the other. As soon as one makes a move,
right,
the other's gone. It's almost not quite spontaneous, but it's that nervous energy, I guess, of that they know. Each side knows. They're just waiting for one to make a move. Matt might have more knowledge on that, but
yeah. Oh, he's still muted.
Sorry, I keep muting myself so I don't butt in. But
butt away.
A fairly standard battle would go through the procedures of trumpet blasting. We have this from earlier accounts of the Wars of the Roses. Trumpet blasts and probably speeches by the leaders to gee everybody up and remind them what they're fighting for. And then would open with cannon fire. And, Richard is going to have far more in the way of hardware than Henry's been able to bring to the battlefield. And so from Henry's point of view, then it's a question of, you don't want to stand there just getting fired at by cannons all day. You've got to make some kind of move. Normally you'd move on from a cannon fire to kind of arrow engagement. So these kind of arrow storms. A medieval archer was supposed to be able to fire up to 12 arrows a minute. So you get a few thousand men firing 12 arrows a minute. It's pretty horrendous to be stood underneath that.
I think it's been compared to machine gun fire. Just a hail of arrows coming down. It's that must be one of the most terrifying. Just them couple of seconds looking up and seeing it come down for you, especially since a lot of common soldiers would not have been greatly armed with armor. Sorry.
Yeah, and I think cannon fire, a fairly scary thing for people who, a lot of people at this period, the loudest thing they've heard is the village church bells.
Yeah.
Enough, so to suddenly, if you go to any of the reenactments, the cannon fire it pops your ears and, it shakes you and it shakes the ground that you're standing on. So that's pretty horrendous. So you don't want to be standing there dealing with that for too long. It's not good for morale, especially if you're on Henry's side when you've got less guns than the other guys. And so then, Henry doesn't want to withstand the gunfire or the arrow storm for too long. And so they fairly swiftly move into his vanguard moving forward. And Oxford, who's in charge of Henry's army, seems to have put all of the men, rather than separating them into the three battles, Oxford seems to have put virtually everybody into the vanguard and sends them all in against Oxford. So he's able to get the upper hand against Norfolk, who is leading Richard's vanguard, pretty quickly. And that's decisive. When Norfolk falls fairly early in the fighting, really, and his banner goes down, Richard's army is in big trouble. And when that happens, and Northumberland behind him doesn't join in for whatever reason, whether it's to do with the terrain or the marsh or Northumberland's making a decision, we don't know. But when Northumberland doesn't join in for whatever reason, his vanguard is crumbling. With Norfolk's banner down, his men are in disarray. They don't know what to do. And then Stanley is up on the side there watching still, not engaging. And it really is going to pieces for Richard pretty quickly, which is when you get him making this decision to do this cavalry charge.
And tell me about, there's the rumor, Nathen talked about, that Henry was a coward because he was supposedly at the back, or tell me how, and Richard, even the Tudors talk about how brave Richard was. Tell me how each of the men fought that day.
There's a very famous quote that from Polydor Virgil, that Richard died fighting manfully in the thickest press of his enemies. I think it's fairly unanimous. Richard fought well, he fought great, he fought courageously. I don't think that's completely in doubt. There's obviously the misunderstanding with Shakespeare and his whole "my kingdom for a horse" kind of nonsense that's now been kind of interpreted ever since as a cowardly negative line, when I think the reality was it's actually quite a bold, I'm going to carry on fighting line, which is precisely what he seems to have done in person. From Henry's point of view, the man who's often criticised for being a coward. As I say, you don't travel across sea, across country to a battlefield when you're not a trained soldier and stand there waiting to die. Because again, I do view up until Norfolk goes down, I still think Henry was arguably less likely to win. I don't know, he's going up against a Royal Army, you know, a more cohesive unit than what he had. I still view Bosworth as being Richard's loss, not Henry's win. I think that takes incredible mental strength for Henry to even be on that battlefield. There is disputed suggestions Henry did actually engage in the fighting when Richard attacks him, and apparently, according to some French articles, he helped himself better than people expected because Richard was on him. But even so, you know, Henry, you know, in general, was not part of the fighting. But I mean, that's in one form, that's leadership. Why would you go into the fighting if you're not a fighter to get killed? What is the entire point of you being there? You know, the point is to die an old man in your bed. That's the point. So, Henry may have swung a sword or two, and incredible duress as he's about to be butchered by Richard and Richard's men. Luckily for him, the Stanleys came in, and he had a nice little bodyguard around him to keep him in one piece. But
Matt, do you want to add anything to that portrayal?
I only think that rather than talking about in terms of coward, I mean, I've just been getting lots of people on Twitter telling me that Shakespeare's never been interpreted as Richard being a coward. But, you know, anecdotally, I can tell you lots of people think the horse, a horse, my kingdom for a horse thing is about Richard trying to run away. But I think rather than talking about either side being particularly cowards, it's a difference in a style of leadership. You know, if you look at where warfare goes in the centuries that follow the Tudor years, monarchs don't lead armies anymore. Even generals, you know, they famously, by the 17th, 18th centuries, they're sitting in tents behind the battlefield directing what's going on. And that's what Henry's doing. And I think Richard, I think the contrast is stark, and that's why it stands out. So Richard wants to lead from the front. He wears the crown on top of his head to identify himself as the leader of his army, and he leads this cavalry charge. He's sat front and centre, and he wants to do that. And I think maybe Henry, as a tactical choice, a style choice, whatever it is thinking, I've got Oxford here who knows what he's doing better than I do. So Oxford's the man who's going to lead the army, and I'm going to stay at the back and maybe I'm slightly detached, maybe I'm slightly aloof from what's going on. I'm planning to be the king here. You know, I'm not getting my hands dirty. I've got people to do these jobs for me. So I would probably call it effective delegation rather than any kind of cowardice. You know, it's a tactical choice to play to your strengths, or rather not to force your weaknesses into the fray. You know, Henry could quite easily have put himself in command of the army and at the front of it, not had a clue what he was doing, and then it would have been over quite quickly the other way around. Yeah. So, you know, because it turns out to be the right choice and probably a very clever choice, it's easy to smear him as a coward. But what he actually does is come up with the tactics that win the battle, and that's all that really matters.
Yeah, it's something that particularly irks me because it's very armchair.
In that case, he's a coward.
Yeah. It's very much, you know, armchair leadership, isn't it? You know, we get it today. You know, you get politicians who are making these decisions from their armchairs, and you know, are they supposed to judge particular soldiers in war zones as being cowardly for not doing this, for not doing that? You know, such a left their post. I mean, I couldn't imagine doing that. I can't sit here and accuse somebody 500 years ago on whichever king, whichever side, of being a coward for what they did or what they didn't do. I'm sitting in my armchair. You know, that's particularly what kind of irks me. This kind of cowardly thing. I think it's almost like a lack of respect for the men who were fighting on the field that day, to be honest.
So we have gone an hour, and I want to just be respectful of people's time. And I know there's so much more, but like, so that, I guess just then Stanley comes in, and maybe we can kind of just take it from there and kind of start to wrap up.
The key question is which Stanley?
Okay.
History has always shown that Thomas Stanley came in you know, Thomas Stanley was the older brother, the oldest Stanley brother. He was the Earl of Derby. Well, he became the Earl of Derby and Henry. But, you know, he was the man. And he's come in, saved the day, given Henry the crown, according to Polydor Virgil, the official Tudor court historian, he gave Henry the crown. And, you know, everybody's happy.
Yeah.
His younger brother, William Stanley. Now, William Stanley was executed 10 years later by Henry Tudor for treason. The Great Chronicle, which was written before Polydor Virgil's record, states that William Stanley interceded in the battle and swung the day for Henry Tudor. It was William Stanley who found the crown on the floor. It was William Stanley who gave the crown to Henry Tudor and actually said to him, "Sire, I now make you king," which is pretty bold from a younger brother of a baron, just a mere knight. But what's interesting is that 10 years later, William Stanley is a traitor and he's executed. The story's changed. Like Matt was saying, the Stanleys, the whole Stanley myth around them, how the story changes. The story suddenly, who's William Stanley? He's not there. You know, Polydor Virgil's deleted him. It's Thomas Stanley, you know, which makes me laugh because at the time, if anyone did get to read these records and they were alive at the time, they must have been like, well, that didn't happen. Yeah. No, that's nonsense. So, yes, I think the evidence for me is pretty strong that William Stanley was the, you know, hero or villain, whichever side you're on, of Bosworth. Henry Tudor does not win without Stanley intervention. I don't see it happening. He needed that intervention. He was going down at that charge. Mm-hmm. It was only a matter of time. Yes, Richard's main vanguard had been destroyed, but how long could Henry and his bodyguards have held off Richard and his very well organised, experienced retinue? Mm-hmm. The Stanley completely turned Bosworth around, or William Stanley anyway. I don't even think Thomas Stanley was actually there.
Okay. Matt, do you want to say anything about that?
Only that I'd agree. This is why I think the Stanleys are a little bit shady in all of this. They tended to rewrite a lot of what went on later. Again, I could talk lots of Richard III about Thomas Stanley, but now's not the time. So yeah, you know, I would agree. William Stanley ploughs down the hill. William Stanley's a fascinating character because throughout the Wars of the Roses, he's an ardent Yorkist, whereas Thomas, I think, is much more of a battle avoider and a fence sitter. I mean, there's suggestion that Thomas is behind William joining the Yorkist forces to give himself sort of plausible deniability that it was his naughty younger brother going off and doing this. So maybe Thomas gave William the order to intercede at Bosworth. We just don't know. But I think it is William who gets involved. And again, probably telling because he's such an ardent Yorkist that he chooses to betray Richard III. And I think that has to do with all of this, you know, Richard disaffecting lots of powerful noble people. Richard has a really long history with the Stanleys. There's a feud been going on between them for more than 10 years. And I think some of these things come back to bite Richard at this point. You know, he does what Richard at times when he's younger especially does what he thinks is right, regardless of the consequences. And I mean, he can hardly have foreseen that the consequences would come 14 years later on a battlefield when the Stanleys choose to wade in on someone else's side and ultimately lead to his death. But yeah, I agree with Nathan. Without the Stanleys, I think Richard comes an awful lot closer to winning at the Battle of Bosworth. And that's for the Stanleys. You know, they're one of the few families that come out of the Wars of the Roses in a better position than they went in. You know, they make their money and they make their future, and their descendants are still Earls of Derby today. So they made their family by walking that really fine line of not quite betraying one side, but never quite being entirely on the other side. Yeah. They played that to perfection, and they're one of the few families that come out in 1485 in a better position. You know, Stanley gets his earldom. He's suddenly stepfather to the King of England. And I think that's the product of 30 years of very careful game playing. You know, if you're looking at Game of Thrones, for your Tyrion Lannister, Thomas Stanley's got to be up there somewhere.
I mean, what's crucial to remember with William Stanley as well is that, you know, this whole Stanley fence-sitting thing, possibly Thomas, William fought for the Yorkists. He fought at Blowheath. He fought at Towton. He fought at Tewkesbury. He was there for all his great Yorkist victories. He was also steward of Edward V's household when he was a prince. So one of the princes in the Tower, Edward IV, made William Stanley the steward. William Stanley was completely all in on behalf of Edward IV and Edward V. Again, has he turned because of that, going back to that mixture of opportunism allied with moral outrage? Does he believe, or did he believe at that time that Richard had done over the boys? Because he was so loyal to those boys, to the point that 10 years later he lost his head because when one of them allegedly came back from the dead, he wasn't willing to completely put out the possibility that one of his boys is back and he needs to defend them. So yeah, William Stanley's a complete and utter ardent. I wouldn't say Yorkist, I would say Edwardian Yorkist. Yeah.
I don't know that you even need the moral outrage aspect on what might have happened to the princes in the Tower physically, because I think you can look at what William Stanley will have viewed as his lost opportunity by Edward V being deposed, whether Edward V is alive or dead or whatever's happened to him. From a purely selfish point of view, William Stanley is thinking, I should have been here under Edward V, and I'm finding myself here and falling under Richard III. And who's my answer to that? My answer to that is now Henry Tudor.
Yeah, which, to be fair, is basically the same dilemma half of Henry's army has. Those Yorkists, those Edwardian York. Henry's a Yorkist pretender almost. This is not Lancaster versus York anymore. This is York versus York, with a smattering of Lancastrian veterans still hobbling around. And that's the dilemma that most of Henry's army had. They've lost all their offices under Richard III. They've been booted out of power. They want power back. We still see it today. It's just politics, isn't it, really?
And I think then the idea that it was a vengeance mission for the princes in the Tower who'd been viciously murdered becomes almost this kind of cloak of chivalric respectability that they can throw over slightly more selfish motives.
Yeah.
Well, there we go. We could talk about this for ages. You guys, this has been so great. Matt, thank you so much for coming on. And I want to give you a chance also to talk about where people can get your books too, because I had Nathan introduce himself at the front. So just tell me about your books quickly too, so we can get that.
Yeah, available on Amazon and in no good bookstores anywhere at the moment. But yeah, there's a biography of Richard III called Loyalty Binds Me, which is kind of looks at Richard's full life, so from cradle to grave. So to really give him context, by the time we get to 1483, he's a 30-year-old man with a big history behind him that plays into what happens after that. Also, the survival of the princes in the Tower. So just looking at the theories that the two boys weren't murdered, kind of in 1483. Again, not looking to say that I've solved anything, but only that there's other theories out there that I think are worthy of a little bit of consideration. And yeah, a few other books. I wrote a biography of Richard III's dad, Richard Duke of York, as well. So a few other books around this period.
Excellent. Thank you so much for hopping. It was great to see you guys talking too and having a
fun. He can bail him out to the Richard stuff. Like I said, I'm not too hot on my Richard stuff.
Awesome.
So yeah.
I'm sorry for bursting Nathan's gig.
That was perfect. It was so perfect. So awesome. So I don't see any other questions. A couple people saying thank you and very enjoyable. So that was great. Thank you guys so much. And I'm going to put this up. I'm going to have the recording in. If you want, I can send you guys the links if you want to put it out too to share. But anyway, just thank you so much, Matt. Thank you so much, Nathan. And yeah, happy Bosworth Day, no matter how it went. All right. I'll see. Oh, wait, we do have a quick question. Why didn't the Stanleys weigh in on Henry's side from the outset? Was it a split-second decision to get involved and save Henry?
I guess nobody knows, but I would probably speculate that it's a tactical reason. I mean, what's the point in wading straight in at the start and then getting wiped out without knowing which way the battle's going to go? I mean, you know, you one thing we didn't mention was William Stanley was attainted, I think, by Richard III just before the battle. William Stanley was always on his way out. You know, there was no comeback for William under Richard III. So I don't think he has waited till the end and then made a split decision. I think he knew his decision. He just waited for that. Look, there now Richard's gone. Let's scare him. Because if Henry's army had been completely wiped out straight away, William Stanley could have legged it. That's a very UK slang. Could have fled from the battlefield and perhaps fought another day. So I think it's just tactical.
All right. Awesome. Thank you so much. I said thank you. Okay. Thank you guys. Have a great rest of your evening. And I appreciate your time. I appreciate everybody for coming on. So that Zoom bomb was interesting. That livened things up quite a bit.
That's brilliant. You need to screenshot that.
I will. All right, you guys.
All right, Tara.
Bye.
Bye.